I'm going to kick off our panel. And the first question I have for folks is, so we know that the community foundations across Canada have really adopted the SDG framework for their philanthropic endeavors. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how and why the community foundations use the SDGs. And I think I'll start on this one. I'll start with Allison for a little bit of the sort of national perspective.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending where you are. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited for this conversation because this is something at Community Foundations of Canada we've been thinking and talking about for a long time. So Community Foundations of Canada, or I guess CFC, is the national leadership organization for 191 community foundations across the country. And back when the SDG agenda was released, we took a look at it and we were thinking, you know, this is something global that Canada signed on to. Is it relevant for us in our community foundation network, and how might that be? And we quickly realized that it was something that was extremely relevant. And the reasons for that were that community foundations, we found, are well positioned to work across all of the 17 goals. So community foundations, by their very nature, support all of communities. So they're looking at all different types of community issues. And you know, they're already working on the SDGs without necessarily calling them the SDGs. So oh, I see a comment. Is everyone able to hear me okay, or am I cutting in and out for everybody?
It's a little bit spotty, Allison.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what that might be. My internet connection seems okay. Do you want me to pause and I'll try and come back in a minute? I can also try and switch my audio source.
Yeah, maybe try switching your audio, and if that doesn't work, you could rejoin the meeting.
Okay. Do you want to ask Vanessa or Chris maybe can go while I try and figure this out?
Say, well, Allison's sorting out her audio. I might throw the question over to Chris. So how and why is the Guelph Community Foundation using the SDGs?
Sure. Always easier to follow somebody though. You know, I would explain it this way. The Guelph Community Foundation believes in vital signs, and we are already deliver them. And for those who might not be familiar with vital signs, a vital sign is essentially a report card on the health of your community. It highlights the things we're doing well, and it points out where we need to do more work. So some of these discussions are already happening inside our own communities, and we're already doing some of the work. But using SDGs, it means that we can put a bigger puzzle together, because as Louis pointed out, the SDGs really work from the ground up, so that it starts in your community and it goes up from there. And so in the Guelph Community Foundation, if we are asking grant applicants in their report to go ahead and let us know which vital sign group and which SDG they're applying under, so that we understand where they're going to have the impact, it helps us to prioritize where we're going to grant dollars. And it also helps us to show the community the impact that we've had in a really meaningful way. One of the things that I suspect Allison may have said, and I could be wrong, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but one of the things that I love about SDGs is, first and foremost, the Guelph Community Foundation believes in a community where nobody is left behind. And that was really a challenge given to community foundations from Community Foundations of Canada. And again, that dovetails, it fits so nicely with SDGs, where, and I've already forgotten what I've just said, but if SDGs are making sure that nobody is left behind, community foundations believe in communities where everybody belongs. And I would say you're really saying very similar things through a slightly different adjustment in language. But imagine I can tell you in Guelph, the 4 largest funders meet at the very least quarterly, and that is our city, our county, the United Way, and the Guelph Community Foundation. And imagine if all of us were using the same language, what it means for those applying, what it means when we report to our community, if all of us are investing in our communities and using the same language, it would have tremendous impact. And not just within Guelph, but when you add the next community and London and Toronto and so on and so on, what an amazing tool to align language.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So I think maybe we'll check back in with Allison.
Can you hear me now?
I think so.
Is that working a little bit better for folks?
Yeah, I think that's
You nodding?
Mhm.
Okay, good. I was on a phone call yesterday, and my friend reminded me of that commercial. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? And it took me right back, and I just remember that again twice in 2 days. The commercial, I think, from the 90s. I don't even know what it was advertising. Anyways, I'm glad we're a go. Thank you for your patience. I guess what I was saying was, when the agenda first came out, so Community Foundations of Canada really did an exploration to determine how and does this global agenda fit into our local work as community foundations. And what we found and what we discovered was that, yes, for sure, because community foundations work across all aspects of society. So, they're already working on the SDGs and many of the SDGs without necessarily calling them the SDGs. And we found, I think, as Chris was just saying, that they're a really powerful framework, to communicate the work of the foundation and of the nonprofit and charitable sector, so that we are all using that shared language and working towards the similar goals. And it's a very clear parameters around what's the goal, what are we working on, and where are we currently at. So it also helps us to set targets and goals to work towards progress. And so it provides a little even more direction. So, we're already doing so much work around these issues, but, what's the target that we're trying to meet, and how can we actually start to monitor and track progress towards those targets? And I could talk a little bit about how community foundations are using the SDGs. So they're raising awareness of the SDGs. I think that's one of the first things that community foundations are doing, is hosting conversations, talking about them, using the language. And they're also incorporating the SDGs into community research. So through the Vital Signs program, for example, they are, community foundations are communicating their research more explicitly as aligned to the SDGs where it is aligned. But then they're also taking that extra step to align their research to the SDGs where it may not have been previously. And that can look like also tracking along those targets and more specific indicators where they can. And then doing their community research to track the current conditions and the progress that occurs over time. And as a result, once you have that information and you have that data, it can also inform granting priorities. So really getting clear on the data and the evidence to inform, all right, what's the direction we want to go and how do we want to distribute our resources, so that we can ensure that the projects we're supporting and the groups we're supporting in the community are also working towards those standard kind of goals that we want to achieve in our community. And then the other pieces, the other ways community foundations can work on the SDGs are around advocacy. And so, the SDGs are great because we know they're so interconnected. It's an easy tool to say, okay, what's a systemic issue here, and what are the barriers that we're experiencing or seeing our community in achieving those goals? And so, some community foundations may choose to conduct some advocacy with their municipal governments or other governments or other players to really try and tackle those root causes. And of course, with that comes partnerships. So community foundations are also working on establishing partnerships, because there's only so much we can do alone, right? And everyone's busy, everyone's tapped out. And I think that an important piece is just leaning on each other in the community to work together, leverage each other's strengths, and consult with other community members as well, and really learn and grow and set kind of action plans together to work towards achieving those goals.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. And I'm going to throw the same question over to Vanessa, if you have anything to add to what Chris and Allison have shared.
Thanks, Emily. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I'm probably going to echo a bit of what Chris and Allison have already said, but right away when CFC rolled out this framework across Canada, as Chris said, we do vital signs. We've been doing vital signs for a number of years, and the SDGs were so aligned with our vital signs report, it just made sense to adopt them. Vital signs issue areas are really just proxies, local proxies for the SDGs. So we were, I think, early adopters in the movement to jump on the SDGs bandwagon. And what we really wanted was a consistent framework that would allow us to track progress and impact, as well as set priorities. And vital signs has always served those purposes for us. It's not only a tool to help us create awareness of issues that are facing our community, but it really helps us as a foundation set our strategic priorities for the impact areas that we really want to focus on. But we also liked the SDGs because it's a shared language, and it really promotes working towards something that's much bigger than ourselves and our own communities. Although these goals seemed really big and audacious, we know that change at the global level starts right here where we are at the community, at the grassroots level. So the SDGs really create this sense that we're working towards the same things and we're all on the same team rather than working within our own organizations as silos. I think in recent years, we've also seen sort of our definition of what we consider a community to be shifting and expanding. For example, I'm not sure if we would have so readily adopted the SDGs maybe 10 years ago when our work was so hyper local, but I think what we define as a community has expanded in recent years. We're working more collaboratively at the regional and national level, at least within the Community Foundation movement. And we understand that we're also part of that bigger global impact. Especially too, I think now at the Community Foundation, we're seeing a lot of multi-generational funds where the stewards of these funds don't necessarily reside in London. So we're making more grants that have expanded outside of our community. And I think regardless from a donor standpoint as well, our donors want to see that as a community foundation, we're moving the needle on major social issues, and using the SDGs really demonstrates our commitment and leadership to driving change. And in terms of how we use them, obviously through our vital signs, we've been doing that for a few years now. And our grant application and loan application process has integrated the SDGs and asks applicants to identify which areas that they're impacting. So the goal and the hope is to really hopefully when those organizations report back to us that they're tracking that impact, and that will hopefully, again, feed into our vital signs data to create that feedback loop to create that bigger community reporting effort. And again, really just integrating it through everything we do, even through our annual report, our communications to donors, creating that awareness at every level of our organization.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. And you all sort of touched on the vital signs, and I know you're all quite involved in that work and how your the SDGs from your perspective of a community-based funder, how you use and apply the SDGs. And I think that kind of information can be really valuable for the nonprofits and community organizations on this call. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how the SDGs as sort of a reporting framework with its targets and indicators and its kind of focus on data and advancing and progressing towards these goals is connected in terms of the work you're doing around the vital signs at the community level and some of the work that organizations might be doing individually to kind of track their own impact. So what does the SDGs really look like in connecting that kind of community level reporting with what local organizations are doing? And for this one, maybe I'll start, Vanessa, you just went, so I'll start with Chris this time, if you don't mind.
You know, I think I would lead with this. As a community foundation, we often use phrases like we grant to areas of great need. And 10 years ago, maybe we'd be forgiven when people said, well, how do you know? And we'd say, well, we're hyper local. We talk to the charities. We've got a sense of where the need is in our community. Well, that's still true. That hasn't changed, but we started to talk about, are we moving the needle? And that means you need specific benchmarks. It means that you all have to be looking at the same thing. And what I love about SDGs, and one of the ways that it's easily implemented is, you don't have to do the research. You don't have to figure this stuff out. When you look at the SDGs, benchmarks and goals are there. It becomes much easier to be able to say, here is what we supported, here's the impact it had, and here's the data that we have asked to be tracked and reported back to us.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So it sounds like you're able to connect directly with sort of local organizations and link your impact reporting through the SDG framework. And I think for the next one, I'll pass it over to Allison. And I know that you have sort of a national perspective, but perhaps you could sort of link your sort of national perspective with what's going on at local community foundations, and then right down to local community organizations that are potentially thinking about using the SDGs.
Sure, yeah. So I think, to echo Chris, I think that having a clear sense of the benchmarks and what you're all working towards is kind of the most important piece. And at CFC, we provide a national data set, which was something that we aligned to the SDGs in about 2018. And I know that many community foundations, including London and Guelph, have taken that and kind of run with it and have done additional research to supplement some of the data and indicators that were missing from national data sets. When I say national data sets, I'm referring to things you can get from StatsCan, because our scope is national in focus, but also we want to disaggregate it down to the community level as much as possible, which can be tough. And so it's so important for the community foundations to go out and do that research. And I know that the nonprofit sector contributes so much to that extra research that's done locally. And I know that, in the absence of certain data, community foundations really rely typically on the work of community or nonprofits working locally to get that information. So for example, I know that in Tofino, they have a huge environmental focus, but environmental indicators are really lacking. And so if you look at their vital signs reports, their sources of data for things around SDG 14 and 15, for example, it's all done, all the research is done by local nonprofits and local researchers and things like that. So I know that the not-for-profit sector and the community foundations can really lean on each other when they're seeking that data to establish what's the benchmark. And I think it's important that we recognize too, like Chris was saying, before we could have probably said, we have a sense of what the issues are, but we're not necessarily the experts on hyper specific topics that not-for-profits spend their day breathing in and out. And so it's so important for those relationships to exist and for that data sharing and information sharing to be a two-way street. And I think it can really greatly impact the amount of impact that the community foundations can have locally.
Thanks a lot, Allison. And I'll pass the same question on to Vanessa. And I know that, Vanessa, you recently launched the vital signs reporting in London. So if you could speak a little bit to that, and also to the connection between what's going on at the local organizational level and at the community foundation level.
Sure, thanks, Emily. Well, I think we all know that good social change efforts are always informed, as Chris was saying, by understanding what's really happening in the community. And without that evidence-based approach, we really don't have a sense of what's going on. So as a community foundation, we really use tools like vital signs and the SDGs to act as a roadmap and tell us where we should go and what issues we should focus on. And this year, we launched a new component of our vital signs program, which is the London Vital Signs Data Hub. And so we took a bit of a different approach where we sort of have a really action-oriented call to action and campaign, but then on the back end, if you really want to dive deeper into data, if you're a local organization that's needing data for your advocacy and social change efforts, the hope is that you'll be able to find it here. And it's a long-term project that we're building out, but it's organized by the SDGs. And as I said, it's at the starting point right now. So we've used sort of what we've gotten at the national level from CFC to start, but we're inviting local organizations to contribute to this project. And in an ideal world, if all organizations in the community were using SDGs to track their progress and impact, this would feed beautifully into this larger community data hub that we're hoping to create, because we'd all be speaking the same language. So that's really the ultimate goal for us with this data hub. And when we ask our grant and loan applicants to use this framework to sort of identify which areas that they're going to be impacting, we're really trying to create that built-in feedback loop for us, where when we fund projects, we can also tell if any change has happened or not. So that's also one of the purposes of our vital signs, is that not only do we want to communicate about what the state of the community is at this point in time, but we also want to share about what has changed, for better or for worse. And the challenge, I think, right now is that, as Allison said, we rely on a lot of local organizations for that data. But year to year, when we produce our vital signs report, it can be hard to get our hands on data that is consistent and tracking the same things over time. So I think that's one of the benefits of everyone, hypothetically, if they're using the SDGs, we'd have a consistent way of measuring impact over time.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. And just picking up on one of the last points you made around the importance of, and I think Allison made this point too, the importance of local organizations in populating that data hub and finding that local data. And I wondered if you could all speak a little bit to maybe some of the challenges that you recognize around local organizations adopting the SDGs and as sort of data frameworks and impact frameworks for their work. Yeah, I'm just curious about what some of those challenges are that you see in your communities. And maybe I'll just flip it back to Vanessa to start this one off.
Sure. I think the first thing is awareness and education. So we're just like everyone's here today. I think getting the word out, getting more awareness about what the SDGs are and how organizations can practically implement them in their own organization is a starting point. I know, as I kind of said at the beginning, it seems like this big, audacious, really daunting framework, because there's 17 goals, they're global goals. So sometimes it can kind of feel like, how is my organization ever going to be able to, have an impact in these areas? But I think it's really important to start small and recognize that also not all of the SDG indicators and goals may not necessarily be applicable to your work or your community. So it's okay to create proxies. It's okay to make them localized. And luckily in London, the work that Luis previously did with Michael Curry at the Poverty Research Center in localizing the SDGs to London is a huge step forward in that process. But I think in order to work together towards these issues, like a symphony really starts from working from the same song sheet or speaking the same language. So I think using them in whatever way you can, even if it's starting small and focusing on just a couple of them. Perfect example, our vital signs report, although we do have the larger data hub that covers all 17, we're only focusing on 6 vital sign issue areas, which only covers a handful of the SDGs, because reasonably, those are 6 areas that we've set as a priorities for our foundation. And we feel like that's manageable for us right now. So don't feel like you have to tackle all 17 of them.
Thanks for that, Vanessa. And Chris, from your experience in Guelph, what do you think some of the challenges are?
I can go back a few years, and the first time SDGs were presented to me, I heard UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I thought, but I live in Southwestern Ontario. We don't really have these kinds of problems with water, and we don't have this kind of poverty here. It took less than an hour and I didn't have to do any reading, for somebody to point out how some of these things applied in communities all over Canada. And it became really apparent that these apply everywhere. And what I would say is, I'm going to underscore something I said before. The beautiful part is the work is done for you. The language is here, the benchmarks are here, solutions are here. It becomes a really easy way to be able to include them, to look at them, to align with other groups in your community. It's actually a really helpful thing to bring everybody together. I think that there's a really good point about biting off what you can chew. And the fact is, just because there are 17, all 17 may not apply to you. And I want to be respectful of time, but if I may, oh so quickly, I'm going to point to goal number 2, which was zero hunger. And I'm just going to read it directly from the website. Goal 2, end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. How could the Guelph Community Foundation possibly get behind and push this forward? Well, top to bottom, the very first vital focus we did as a secondary pandemic effects as we went through COVID was on food insecurity and how things were exacerbated. COVID only made things worse, brought more attention. And we had the opportunity to ask, what is food security? Not so much to ask, but to be able to educate people so that whether they understood it, whether it was around them or whether it applied to them, it helped to frame it. And when I look at our annual report last year, we're able to connect all of the dots. And as a funder, we're not necessarily delivering programs as many people on this call may be themselves, but I can point to a grant in action, $13,700, which went to Everdale, growing 40 tons of food for Guelph, Wellington, and emergency food agencies. And the very brief write-up is so specifically aligned to SDGs. It's a community farm that promotes equitable access to food by growing produce for the most vulnerable. Was able to grow over 41,000 tons of food that was harvested by volunteer community members. And it provided volunteers with an opportunity to get outside, spend time with other people who are like-minded. And the food they grow makes a difference for thousands of community members served by emergency food provision agencies that are part of the Seeds distribution network in Guelph, Wellington County. And if I can just add, the Seed Food Hub is one of the coolest things you can ever come across, in the sense that when you fill your basket with groceries, it is a pay what you can service. And so while there may be recommended prices, and Chris Willard may put down $40 for his bag of veggies and produce, the next person with the exact same basket may be putting down the last $5 they have for a week's worth of fresh produce and veggies. And I just love that because of SDGs, we can connect this top to bottom. It makes a difference to who we fund, how they apply to those we support. It provides the full framework. I'll cut myself off there.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. I think I might just throw this question over to Allison, because I know you work with communities across Canada on vital signs work and work related to the SDGs. So in just a minute or two, if you can share sort of what some of the challenges you see around local organizations connecting to the SDGs through data collection and reporting.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And the thing that I see the most is similarly to what Vanessa was sharing, a lack of, I feel like there's a feeling of overwhelm almost, it just seems like, there's so much to it. There's 17 goals. It's a very academic, product that's coming out of the UN, folks don't necessarily see the relevance or the connection to the work that they're doing locally on the ground. And so I think that that's the first big barrier that we see, is people just saying, like, I'm tapped out. I don't have time to understand, what are all these 17 goals and how are they possibly relevant locally. So I think that there's a bit of awareness raising that needs to happen, and just kind of really simplifying things to make it really accessible. And like Vanessa was saying, you can use proxy indicators. You can just think about things kind of at a higher level. Like, if we're working towards SDG 3 and we want to promote good health and well-being, what does that look like? And you can get really specific on this, like specific indicators, the targets you want to reach, but even just reframing the way you're thinking about your work to say, oh, I'm working on SDG 3, I'm a contributor, I'm doing some work on that, is I think the first step and the easiest step. So I think it's really clarifying for people. It doesn't have to be a huge reorientation of your work. And also, I think just helping people to understand that even though it's a global agenda, local action is so important and so relevant. And so I think that that's another disconnect. People hear UN global agenda and they're kind of, like, that's not relevant to me locally. So I think that there's definitely some, that's a barrier that I think could be addressed with, like, I don't know, more conversation. That's just talking about, while it's a global agenda and these are global issues, the change is going to happen from the community level, right? The UN's not going to come and fix things in London. Like, I think that that's every little community, aggregates up to a province, aggregates up to a country, which aggregates up to a global, right? And so I think that that's the piece that really people need to better understand, is just how it relates to them in their day-to-day. Because it does. I think it's just a lack of a clear narrative or understanding around that sometimes.
Thanks a lot, Allison. And I'm going to pass it over now to Luis, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can really activate the SDGs in our communities and speak directly to some of the nonprofit folks who are on this call. So Luis, take it away.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for all the contributions. It's really a fascinating discussion. I'm just trying to take notes of what all you guys are saying. I think we touched a little bit on this, because I really want to shift the focus, as Emily said, the focus a little bit here of what the SDGs are and mean, and how they've been used, and how the community foundations have been using to shift the perspective to the nonprofit sector, and how they can use, and how is this relevant and important for them. Chris, you mentioned the importance of having using the same language, and Allison talked about how the community foundations are using by tracking indicators, raising awareness, having conversations, understand what are the main issues in the community, even as an advocacy tool. And Vanessa also spoke about the vital signs being a proxy for that. It's really interesting. So I want to, maybe this is kind of our starting point, is how daunting can the SDGs be? And I think you made two good points, which is you can summarize that as the SDGs being eye-opening. So even though they're daunting, it's interesting to actually sit back and reflect, oh, I didn't think about this before. Looking at this global framework, this actually applies right here in my city. And also in the sense that to connect the dots, like just to give like a more practical example, you can have, I don't know, a social initiative to support homeless people, but they're using disposable products like single plastic use. So even though it's clear what their main mission is, having the SDGs to try and connect the dots with the other dimensions is important. And on the same side, you can have an environmental group doing great work to support oceans or life on land, but maybe they don't have an equity and diversity and inclusion governance structure, and they have a very narrow vision and opinions in the organization. So again, I think the SDGs can be this eye-opening. And like I said, shifting more to what the nonprofit sector needs, I think the first question, and this makes more sense for Chris or Vanessa to answer first, the work that you've been doing in London and Guelph, Can you describe some of the ways that your grantees are integrating the SDGs into the work, or how they're trying to integrate the SDGs into the work? Do you have any examples in London of Guelph of nonprofits that are doing this?
I can jump in first, I guess. So as I mentioned earlier, for us, all of our grant applications and our loan application processes have integrated vital signs in the SDG. So right off the hop, we're sort of encouraging organizations, if you're applying to us, to really start thinking in this lens and using this framework. So with that, the hope is also when they submit their reports that we'll see some of those impacts come through in terms of the reporting by the SDGs. And I'll name one organization, and not to single them out, but I just was reading a recent report for them. And I think they were also one of the early adopters in our community, and that's the Green Economy London. So Green Economy London is an organization who's really aligned themselves, but also been able to integrate the SDG framework really well into their work. And we're an early adopter, I think, in our community. And basically, for those of you who aren't in London, who haven't heard of this organization, they help companies and organizations reach environmental targets. So as you can probably imagine, it's really aligned with a lot of the environmental SDGs. So we recently got, I think it was a 2-year grant report back for them, because LCF was one of the first investors in this initiative. But we're seeing explicit reports back on some of these SDG indicators like greenhouse gas emissions. And what's really cool about this initiative is it doesn't stop with their organization, because they're working with local organizations and companies to also meet these targets. It has that ripple effect. So that's one that stands out in my mind.
Thanks, Vanessa. And then can I go to you, Chris? And we're talking about the nonprofits using the SDGs in relation to funders, specifically the community foundations in our case here. But also, can you speak to how nonprofits can use the SDGs, maybe even in the same way that the community foundations are using the SDGs, like to track, to advocate, or for other applications? Like, do you see nonprofits using that in different ways as well?
There is absolutely no question. And I have a smile. I recognize my smile. I'm going to be every moderator's worst nightmare and go off script for a second. But I'm going to go ahead and say, well, sure. The Guelph Community Foundation is a charity who has adopted SDGs. And I realize that's an obvious statement. I can tell you, meeting with a local brewery and talking about meaningful impact, I was caught off guard when they asked how we prioritize and how we define impact. And I talked about vital signs and SDGs, and I had 3 executives hopping out of their seats, asking what we do for SDG number 14, life below water. And it's a really interesting moment as a charity ourselves, aligning the needs of a donor, of a funder, to be able to connect some dots in a way that is deeply embedded in their corporate social responsibility statements, and to suddenly turn something, where we make comments and impact statements about impact, and to be able to connect in this really deeply meaningful way, a relationship that I wasn't sure that I'd be able to foster and develop, has turned into a lovely runaway train where I'm struggling to keep up with them now because they're so excited the way these dots have connected. And so I'll turn my smile off because I've inserted the Guelph Community Foundation as an example of a charity that has benefited from the relationship. But I think it's important, and it's not just charities and not-for-profits. Others are adopting these kinds of framework as well. Now you're welcome to bring me back on or ask the question again, but I think you may be done with me after that answer.
No, that was a great, and I really like what you highlighted there, Chris. It is true that there, like I mentioned at the beginning, business, government, academia, and even other funders. We're having a conversation with the community foundations here, but we have other big funders and investors in Canada that are really looking at SDGs more seriously. We do have, I don't have the link of it with me right now, I can share that later, but we have a report from Canada Life, and the title of the report escapes me right now, but it's something like, this is not a niche thing anymore, sustainable development and the SDGs, and how they're focusing not only their funding initiatives, but also the investments and framing their investments and prioritizing their investments, aligning them with the SDGs. So we really see that momentum that is taken in other parts. Alison, would you like to add something to our conversation here? And when you're talking about how nonprofits, organizations can use or are using the SDGs in their work?
I think that Vanessa and Chris did a great job covering that.
So I think that the next obvious question is, what resources do you see out there to support the activation of the SDGs for nonprofit organizations? Like, let's say that we're doing a good job here, and you know, a lot of people hearing this webinar, it's thinking, this is a thing, the SDGs, I want to do this. Like, do you see supports, and maybe this is from the community foundations, maybe this is somewhere else, like what supports do you see for the SDGs? Can I start with you, Alison, on that one?
Sure. I think I got a little distracted by a great question in the chat too. My brain was already kind of on this topic. So I think, you know, I think that there are resources that exist globally, of course, on the UN's website that kind of explain what the SDGs are. And it's very broad, you know, across the world. What are all of the things you need to know in order to track your progress? The government of Canada has released some content as well. So there's the SDG Data Hub, which is a place where you can go online and kind of click through each SDG, and there's references to which indicators are most relevant and sources for those indicators. And they've also released the Canadian Indicator Framework, which has specific targets, and they've actually just recently updated it to look at what are the most relevant indicators and what are some proxy indicators that we can use in a Canadian context. So when you're looking at a very hyper, you know, data focused, how do we align to the agenda? There's some great resources there. But then, you know, to come back to our conversation, I think that the local community work and the frameworks that you can come up with kind of locally that are most hyper relevant to your context in community are those that are most relevant and important. And I think a lot of that work comes from the not-for-profit sector. And I think it's done by a lot of different kind of folks working together to really come together and think about what are the ways that we can integrate the SDGs locally. And I think community foundations do great work around that. And I know that some communities across Canada have also been working on something called the Voluntary Local Report, which I believe London has one of. And what that is so there's voluntary national reports where every country that signs on to the UN should be releasing kind of like an update to the UN about their progress and how things are going, and taking stock of conditions within the country. And some communities, I don't remember which was the first, I might have been in Los Angeles, I'm not sure, but somewhere people got frustrated by the lack of action being done nationally. And so the community really stepped up and said, you know, we're going to do a voluntary local report. And those are great resources. I think that folks on this call, Luis, I think you actually participated in some of that work as well in London. So that's a great place as well. I think there's some resources there. And then of course, think tanks. The name is escaping me. It might be the Broadband Institute. If I've got that right, they released a report basically about how do we take stock and what's the framework for implementation in Canada. So there are tons of resources out there. I think, there's also fact sheets and FAQs, and, if you look, they're out there. So maybe Vanessa and Chris, you guys have some ideas of what's actually available in your communities, but I know there's a huge amount of resources out there.
Hey, Allison, can I ask you a question? The
Okay.
Community Foundations of Canada SDG Guidebook and Toolkit, is it available for anyone?
I haven't looked at that in about a year, so you're catching me on camera, Chris.
So
I don't remember exactly the target audience, if it applies both to not-for-profits. I know we've created that for community foundations, but you know what? It's so wholesome. I believe that we could probably, if it was provided to nonprofits, they could probably take a lot of the similar lessons from it, with the caveat that I believe it was written with the target market for community foundations. So just reading it with that in mind.
This is a guidebook, a 40 some odd page guidebook written for community foundations across Canada. So I can all but guarantee that there is a foundation in the community that you reside, or there's one nearby. Ask them for it. I'll be honest, it's one of my touch points. I go to it regularly. And the reason I go to it is because somebody has taken great thought and care to lay things out in a way where it says, what are they? What's the national picture? What is your opportunity? What are the tools to advance SDGs, partnerships, organizing? It's a great document to reference. It helps you to overcome obstacles and understand how you might deploy them, deploy some of the tactics to get around obstacles. And, as a simple tip or trick, start introducing the language in your reporting, in your board, because these things stick and you'll find that you're embedded and using them before you even meant to. Let me also add, I spend a good deal of time on the SDGs website. There is great information there, and there are 17 goals, and so I do go there regularly to look at what the targets are, the publications that are available, benchmarks, and there's some really great information there. I like to think I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but I can tell you, I don't have all 17 goals in focus. Well, no, I was going to say not for more than a minute, not even for a minute. I can only manage about 3 at a time. But between that website and Community Foundations of Canada, I feel well supported.
Chris, that's a great plugin for the guidebook of the Community Foundations and the SDGs website. We have a few more minutes before I want to dive into the Q&A. We have some great questions in the chat. So maybe we can try to answer one, and if you have time, 2 last questions in short answers, 1 or 2 minutes. And really, this is what we call here at Pillars, kind of a future weaving exercise. So thinking ahead, what can you imagine for your community if more of the organizations you support begin to use and engage with the SDGs? How does that future look like, Vanessa?
I think greater collaboration, working together to address our community's most pressing issues. Ideally, also a more informed approach in terms of evidence-based program and policy decisions with stronger data and reporting.
Thanks for the beautiful and concise answer. Chris.
I've had my airtime. I'm going to smile and nod and say, yeah, what Vanessa said.
Thank you. And I know this is more a kind of a local question, Allison, but do you have anything to add for that one?
I mean, what Vanessa said, I think clear goal orientation, an increased shared kind of framework and the ease of partnerships and alliances with around those clear goals, and just working together to achieve more tangible and defined outcomes.
Perfect, thank you. And Chris, we had this one last question that maybe you already answered, which is great. Again, it might be daunting. We're like in this learning curve. There's a lot of raising awareness. We saw at the beginning that some people have some familiarity with SDGs and is struggling actually to how use it, like implement, what does that mean in practical terms. So step one, to use, let's say you're not using the SDGs yet. Step one, what is one thing that nonprofits could do to start using the SDGs, start their SDG journey? You want to get us started?
Everybody on this call does amazing work. I guarantee it. We're all inspired. We're all motivated. We all have mission, vision statements that we lean into. If you take a look at SDGs, and if you take a look at what the goals are and what the benchmarks are, you're going to have a moment, you are going to have a moment where you recognize that you're already doing some of those things. And some of the things you're not will be good ideas. Some of them may not align well with your organization, but that's okay. And there may be other things that you go, that's something we're going to start in the future. And I would say you have to start somewhere. That's an easy and a safe place to start, and to start to engage and embrace SDGs.
Thanks, Chris. Vanessa, would you like to have a first step idea?
I think Chris hit the nail on the head. You're already doing the work. I know capacity is an issue for all of us. Start small, choose 1, 2 goals, start there. Yeah, you're already doing the work. It's just a matter of integrating that language into what you're already doing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that we really need to highlight this, that the SDGs is not starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel, even though we have an SDG wheel, but it's really more of an alignment. And like you mentioned that also during our conversation, it's kind of this eye-opening thing. It's how just to understand those interconnections and share this language. And every time when we're learning a new language, right? But we start with our ABC, so we definitely need to start slow. Alison, do you have any final thoughts, ideas on this before we jump on our Q&A? And Anna is collecting some of the questions. We might not be able to answer all of them, but I'll try to answer as many as possible. And maybe even after the call, we can try to address some of those questions. Alison?
Yeah, for sure. I think I was going to say exactly, don't reinvent the wheel. You're already doing the work. Just identify kind of where you fit into the picture of your community and which SDG you're working on. And you know, I'm going to push it one step further and say, start to talk to community members and think about how you can work together and lean on each other, leveraging your strengths and expertise and working with others who have differing strengths and resources to really push forward the agenda. And I think if you're ready, the next step, I think, and you know, the thing that, because what I'm struck by is we're saying a lot of like, don't reinvent the wheel, like you're already doing this work. The thing that's different about the SDGs that I think is the first step for every single person is think about equity and think about the mandate of the SDGs, which is to leave no one behind. So maybe you're already doing the work, but how can you include more voices at the table? I think that's the first step, is to think about, even in your own organization, your own business, you don't have the capacity to deeply engage, at least think about who's not at the table and how can you bring them in.
That's a great way to wrap up our section here. And I think not only the SDGs with leaving no one behind, but most of the framework, or if maybe even all the frameworks that we know are framing that in some way, even like the common approach. The underlying principle is engaging all your stakeholders throughout the whole process, and many other, the SDG impact standards and many more. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass it over to Emily. She's probably harvesting some of the questions at the Q&A with Anna. And we can, I guess we might have answered some of those questions already. But Emily, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I've just been reading through the chat and there's some great questions. And I think I'm going to start with one that speaks directly to community foundations. And this one's from Dean, and he was just asking about, or saying that many community foundations prioritize social issues, and wondering about how the foundations, through your granting and your philanthropic work, prioritize some of the other dimensions of sustainability along with advancing those social issues. And I guess we can speak again to the SDG framework and how that might help. Yeah, so I'll just let whoever, Allison, I see you unmuted.
This is something that I think is so important and I'm really excited about. So, you know, I think across the network, we see that the environment is frequently lower on the list of things that a community foundation is working on. And I think that's just a reflection of, you know, where we've been and where we're coming from, and recognizing that the environment and climate change isn't more emergent in the philanthropic sector, you know, nowadays than it has been in the past. And I think that we are seeing shifts towards, you know, more granting towards environmental initiatives, more, you know, speaking about climate change, more research around climate change. And I know that that's coming, but it's not always the super most apparent thing, especially with vital signs when it's hard to get environmental data. You know, the indicators are lacking nationally, and when we do have them, they're provincial, or, you know, it's looking at a whole watershed. And so it can be hard at the community level sometimes to really get that data. But I think there's changes coming, and something that we're really excited about at CFC is that there, in advance of COP26 in November, there is a global or organizational effort of the philanthropic sector to sign a pledge on climate change. And so Community Foundations of Canada is working across the sector in Canada with Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, Environment Funders Canada, and the Circle to figure out how we can take the global pledge, which is basically philanthropic organizations across the world coming together saying, you know we haven't done enough and we're committing to do more. And so at CFC, we're together working with our partners on an implementation package and guidance for community foundations, as well as other foundations working in Canada, to really start to advance the sector's work on climate change. And so this is like hot off the press. I think we've just released it. We're starting our initial outreach now, but it's something that we're really hoping to see the Community Foundation Network sign on and work on with us. And we've got dedicated resources to support the work of the sector across the country.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Allison. And I just wondered if Chris or Vanessa had anything to add, speaking directly to your work in communities and perhaps using the SDG framework as a tool.
So if I may, I'll comment and say, at the Guelph Community Foundation, we are, for lack of a better description, we're a mid-sized community foundation. We represent about $15 million assets under administration, and last year total granting was about $1.2 million, but that included a large sum for COVID-19 community response. We ourselves don't deliver programs. And as an organization, as a funder who believes in the work that all of you do, we take a somewhat passive approach. And I would say my passive approach is we ask you during your application, and it's a brief application because we don't want to bog you down with a massive 50-page essay. It's about 4 or 5 questions. But one of those questions is, which SDG do you align with? And what is the impact you will have? And that winds up being a fairly passive approach, but you also can't get past those questions. And you're fully aware that we prioritize our grants along vital signs and SDGs as you apply. So I may not do advocacy work in the community. My time is applied in different ways. I would say it still comes through loud and clear. And it's still very apparent in the reporting that we do.
I can just add to that quickly as well. Building on what Chris said, I think by default, using the SDGs as part of our application process for grants and loans, we're taking that intersectional lens. So when a project comes through and they're checking multiple SDGs, that's more checkpoints for us. Because the SDGs are so intersectional. In a lot of cases, the hope is that, you know, you're tackling more than one issue at a time, especially for some of our grant programs that are looking for sort of that systemic level systems change approach.
Thanks a lot, Chris and Vanessa. I'm going to hop to another question from Eric. And this one was around sort of, we see all of this impact reporting and reporting on positive impact in our communities related to the SDGs. And the question is around, do you see any organizations that are tracking perhaps their negative impacts related to the SDGs? And I wonder, Vanessa, with the new local data hub in London, if this is something that you've talked about, or working with organizations to track both the positive and the negative impact of their work.
This is a really good question. And I think, you know, the goal with our data hub is to track trends, whether they be positive or negative. We just want to see in what direction our community is going on these various issue areas. But I think also at like a systems level in the philanthropic sector, and maybe Allison could add to this, I know community foundations are really taking a look internally at some of our internal process, even with our investments, to make sure that we're investing in areas that are socially responsible and really aligned with our mission as community foundations in everything that we do. And that goes with the same approach we have with impact investing. We're really trying to align more and more our investments and our mission together. So we're trying to put our money where our mouth is, in short.
If I can just add something quickly, this is a great question. And the SDG impact standards were released recently, and they actually are explicit about trying to map out your negative impacts first. And obviously they're talking about the whole spectrum of enterprises, for-profit, non-profit, social enterprises, all kind of business, investment companies. But I think even though this might be a little more obvious to organizations who are using slave labor or like dump chemical waste into the river, I think this also applies to social enterprises and nonprofit and even philanthropic organizations to understand the impact that they have, positive and negative. And I think, again, the SDGs can be this eye-opening to when you actually try to, you don't have to address all the 17, but going through the exercise of trying to link what you do with those issues, you can find those connections. And sometimes that connection can be a negative connection. So yeah, that's a great question, Eric. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I'd say it, Eric, that was the question when I read it, and I thought, oh man, what a great question. It scared me a little. As a mid-sized community foundation, you know, it was just this year that we finally got ESGs into our investment policy statement. And so it's a big change. We're still coming through that. We adopted SDGs, I think, in about 2017. So we're still learning and applying it. Negative impact, you know, I lay it out this way, we'll get there. We're always leaning in a positive and forward direction. Change comes fast, and we are nimble, but we're not always that fast. It's a lot to take in. So I'm earlier in my journey to be able to give you a really robust answer for that just yet.
Thanks for the honesty, Chris.
Yeah. And Allison, I'm wondering if you had anything to add just in your experience working across the country.
No, not really. I mean, I think it's a great question. And I also had a similar reaction as Chris. It's just, oh my God. I think it really comes down to being brave, right, at your organization and admitting to yourself, you know, everyone wants to feel like they do good work, but, you know, sitting down with yourself and thinking, what are actually the negative outcomes of the things I'm doing, or the partnerships I have, or the investments, like that's a hard exercise. you know, really being honest with yourself about those things. And I think it's a piece of bravery that you need to have as an organization, to be willing to not only look it in the eye and accept it, but then to actually commit to changing.
And I want to add that I think, like Chris mentioned, I think this is, again, maybe early stages of that journey, but I do think that specifically the Community Foundations Canada and the community foundations around Canada are looking into this, because I've seen a lot of reflections, public reflections, and trying to reframe how, and even question how the funding works and how those structures are actually perpetuating some of those systemic issues that we have in our community here in Canada. So I think that is not that we are oblivious to that, but it's definitely, again, a way that the SDGs are pushing us to rethink the way that we do our work, not only how we deliver our services and programs, but also our internal process as an organization. Really great question. I think we might have time for maybe one or two more, right, Emily?
Yeah, I have another one from the chat. This one is from Judith, and the question, part of the question was just about integration of the SDGs in such a siloed ecosystem. And I think from a community foundations perspective, you work with organizations with a lot of different focus areas. And I'm wondering if you could speak at all to what SDG localization or what adopting the SDGs might mean in our ecosystem where folks' work is perhaps a little bit siloed and focused on specific targets and outcomes. I'm not sure who wants to speak to that first, or maybe that's a question we can't answer.
At the Guelph Community Foundation, we love collaboration. We love leading by example and trying to collaborate with all sorts of partners, some that make sense, some that are strange, sometimes they work. Sometimes I have to go back to my board and say, yeah, so we're not going to do that anymore. It's interesting to hear that people still think the work is so siloed. And it makes me wonder if I have blinders on inside my own community, because we work really hard to include everybody's work and all sorts of things. And just as a very quick example, we have an executive director peer group that meets monthly. And it's because otherwise we're alone operating in isolation. We have a funders forum. I mentioned it quickly earlier, where the 4 largest funders meet at the very least quarterly so that we can discuss impact, what got left out, where can somebody else step up and close a gap. And while I might not get to say the Guelph Community Foundation fixed, solved, or supported something, I'm always able to say we had influence. And so I think really my short answer is I'm not the right person to answer that.
I think those are a couple of good examples of how you're maybe addressing some of that siloed work and collaborating across organizations, and with an SDG, maybe an SDG focus to that collaboration as well. Vanessa or Allison, did you have anything to add?
Something that we've been trying to do over the past years with our vital signs reports is something called vital conversations. So we've been trying to, again, to create more awareness about SDGs and sort of the interconnectedness and how we can all work together, host events that are focused on, each event is focused on a different vital signs issue area. And we would have sort of like TED Talk style speakers with some experts or individuals who have lived experience or people that are working on the ground in that area, share some of their perspectives, and then the audience would break out into groups where they would discuss that issue area through the lens of the various SDGs. So that's one thing that we've been trying to do to create more awareness building. And then again, through our granting process, we have one program in particular called our Community Vitality Program. And that program, we do also ask applicants to identify which issue areas they're impacting through our vital signs and SDGs. And that program, really, we look for community collaboration when we fund those projects. So through that application projects, we're really trying to facilitate that community collaboration to try to achieve these targets.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vanessa. Another good example. And Allison?
I would say also the vital conversations are a really effective tool, especially if you're able to invite and connect with folks from all different sectors or from all different topic areas or lived experiences. Those are the most powerful kinds of events where you can have people sitting around a table working through an issue together. And that can be useful at any stage. You can provide that after you've done your community research and you say, this is what we've identified as the issue. How do we solve it together? And have the folks in the room that can help. But also it's a good tool to use to learn and to say, you know, what are you seeing in the health sector? What are you seeing over here? Let's dig in and how can we all work together, you know, either with resources or decision-making authority or manpower, what have you, grassroots, you know, networks, and to come together to do that, I think is a really powerful tool.
Thanks a lot for that, Allison. So I think, unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, but thanks so much for those really thoughtful questions. And I mean, at this stage in our SDG Cities project, those questions are really going to help us inform future events and our work going forward. So again, thanks so much for those really thoughtful questions. And we just have a couple things to share before we wrap up. First of all, thanks so much to Chris and Allison and Vanessa for giving us an hour and a half of your time today and sharing all of your insights. I think this was really valuable and a great start to our community learning series. And Luis, do you want to talk about the Academy coming up in January?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so one of the main pieces of programming that we're going to have at the SDG Cities is the SDG Cities Academy. And it's really a training opportunity for enterprises to understand what the SDGs are and learn how they can apply, how they can integrate in the work that they're doing, either for measuring their impact, to help with their strategic planning, to, like many of you said, to learn how you can use that to communicate to other stakeholders, partners, local, provincial, or federal government, funders, investors, and all different kinds of partnerships. We are in the middle of designing the curriculum, finalizing the curriculum for the Academy, and stay tuned. We're going to have applications open soon. So if you're a nonprofit that is willing to learn more how to use and integrate the SDGs, the Academy might be a great fit for you. So our plan is to have this started in the winter of 2022, so early 2022. Emily, anything else about the Academy? Did I miss anything there?
No, that sounds great. And I just wanted to add that we're going to follow up this event with a brief survey. And if you have time to fill it out, that would be great. It will really help us shape future programming and get some ideas for our community learning series going forward. So you'll find that in your email. And we'll also send along these resources that Chris and Vanessa and Allison mentioned that can help nonprofits really activate the SDGs in their work. So we'll be sure to share those out as well. So look in your email for all that information.
Right at the top of the hour.
Yep, right on time. So we're going to wrap up now. And thanks again, Allison, Vanessa, and Chris. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yep, have
a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.